Jack Ewing has been working as a journalist in Germany since 1994, including more than a decade as a correspondent at Business Week magazine. He joined the New York Times in January 2010 as a business and economics writer based in Frankfurt. During his rookie year at his new job, Jack won a New York Times Publishers Award in 2011 for coverage of the European debt crisis. Keeping steady in his pursuit of having an illustrious international career as a journalist, Jack continued to write about business, banking, economics, and monetary policy from Frankfurt. Another part of Jack Ewing's coverage included the European car industry, which gave motive for him to write his new book, Faster, Higher, Farther, The Volkswagen Scandal. Faster, Higher, Farther has found an appreciative audience with readers and critics alike. In praise of Ewing's research and narrative style, Publisher Weekly writes, Ewing's compelling prose makes his book read like entertainment more than education, and the story of Volkswagen's fall, how the company cheated emissions testing devices, was exposed by West Virginia University researchers, and finally was publicly cited by the EPA, is a study in corporate hubris. Interest in this now faded scandal may be confined to a niche audience, but readers who pick up the book will be glad they did. Please join me in welcoming Jack Ewing.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Mark, and it's great to be here at Politics and Prose, which I understand is quite an institution in the Washington area. The way that this book got started was that John Glussman, the editor-in-chief of Norton, sent me an email one day asking if I ever thought of writing a book about the Volkswagen scandal to let him know, and I let him know about 5 minutes later that I would be interested. And one of the first things, when we were talking about how the book should be written, one of the first things that he said to me was, Jack, you know, I don't care about cars. I'm not a car person. You have to write a book that I still want to read. So I sort of quarrel with what Publishers Weekly said about this being for a niche audience, because I've tried to make it a tale that's really about ambition, abuse of power. It's a book about how a toxic organizational culture can push ordinary, basically decent people to commit crimes. And it's also a tragedy because the whole scandal threatens the jobs of literally hundreds of thousands of Volkswagen workers who had nothing to do with the wrongdoing. Let me talk just very briefly about the history of Volkswagen, because that has an impact on what happened later. Volkswagen was actually basically a propaganda project by the Nazis. They wanted to, Hitler was upset that middle-class Americans were driving around in Model Ts and Germany had nothing equivalent that everybody could afford. So they came up with the idea of the people's car, the Volkswagen, and he hired a guy named Ferdinand Porsche to design it. And that's what later became the Beetle. This was in the late 30s, but actually they never managed to build that many cars before the war got started, and the factory in Wolfsburg was shifted to military production. Then after the war, it could well have happened that Volkswagen never existed because the factory was bombed out. As I said, they never actually produced that many cars. And what saved the company was actually a British major who was part of the occupation force, and he noticed the Beetle standing around in the rubble. And the British Army at the time needed transportation, and they had a bunch of workers who needed something to do. So this major, whose name was Ivan Hurst, got them producing the car again. And that was really the beginning of Volkswagen as a company. And as you know, it was the car, the Beetle, was a huge hit. In the post-war market, it was simple and cheap, and it was just what people needed at that time. And it was also very popular in the United States. In fact, by the late 60s, Volkswagen was the leading import brand in the United States. This was before Toyota and Nissan were as big as they are today. But when the Beetle inevitably started to become obsolete, Volkswagen had a lot of trouble replacing it, and by the early 1990s, the company was in pretty serious trouble. There was talk it might go bankrupt. They had built more cars than they could sell, and they were in serious trouble. And this is where the Porsche family comes back into the story. You remember Ferdinand Porsche designed the first Beetle. In the early 1990s, his grandson, whose name was Ferdinand Piëch, became the chief executive. He had come up through the ranks at Audi. And he was in many ways even more of an automotive genius than his grandfather. And he succeeded in turning Volkswagen around. He improved the quality and the styling of the cars. Sales recovered, profits recovered. But he also had a dark side. He was dictatorial. He was known, he had no compunction about firing people that didn't meet his standards, and he was known, there's many anecdotes about him calling engineers into a room and saying, this is what I want you to do, you have this much time, and if you fail, you'll be fired. So it was a very difficult corporate culture. Another of PX's big achievements was in the realm of diesel. Volkswagen was one of the first companies that figured out how to sort of civilize diesel for passenger cars. Diesels were known for being smelly and smoky and noisy, and Volkswagen figured out how to combine engine computers and fuel injection to make diesels much quieter and cleaner than they had been. And just to tell you a little about PX's character, he was an automotive genius on the one side, but while he was head of Volkswagen, there was a number of scandals. There was a corporate espionage scandal. Volkswagen was accused of stealing secrets from General Motors. There was a scandal where the head of personnel was found to have been supplying prostitutes to labor leaders to keep them happy. And Piëch himself was, somebody who just didn't live by the same rules as most of the rest of us. He, just to give you a little anecdote out of his life, he at one point started having an affair with his cousin's wife, had 2 children with her, and at the same time 2 children with another woman. And this is out of 12 children total during his lifetime. And he wrote about all this in his autobiography. It's not something he was ashamed of. If anything, he was proud of it. So after these scandals, there was never really any reform. But at a healthy company, when something like this happens, you should reform the compliance. You should look at your code of conduct. You should think about ways that you can prevent this kind of thing from happening in the future. And that didn't happen at Volkswagen. So in the around the mid-2000s, Volkswagen, there was one thing that Piëch never managed to do during his tenure, and that was to recapture Volkswagen's past glory in the United States. And that bothered him. Around the mid-2000s, Volkswagen decided it wanted to become the largest car company in the world. And they couldn't do that without also being a force in the United States. And by then, actually, Volkswagen had become really just a niche brand. They were selling about as many cars as Subaru. And they had long since been overshadowed by Toyota. So they were looking for a way, some kind of unique selling point that would help get back the market share in the United States. And they hit on diesel. Diesel had been very successful in Europe. By then it accounted for half of all new cars were diesels. The big advantage of diesel is fuel economy. That was a big selling point in Europe, where fuel was very expensive. So they thought, let's try that in the United States, and we'll sell diesel as an environmentally friendly technology and try to go after the same people who might otherwise buy a Toyota Prius. And they decided to develop a brand new diesel engine to do this. But of course the problem was that they found out that they couldn't make the diesel engine clean enough for U.S. emission standards. Europe has a reputation for being more environmentally friendly and strict than the United States, but actually the United States had stricter limits on nitrogen oxides, which are the most harmful component of diesel exhaust. And around 2006, the engineers realized that they couldn't meet these U.S. standards. And probably the smart thing to do would have been to delay the project, look at other technologies, spend some more money, figure out a way to make it cleaner. But that's not what happened. In late 2006, a group of engineers and managers got together at the Research and Development Center at Volkswagen in Wolfsburg, and an information technology guy had prepared a PowerPoint presentation. I'm convinced everything evil that happens at a corporation anywhere starts with a PowerPoint. And the PowerPoint showed how you could, the computer in the engine, which sits under the hood, could recognize the test cycle that the regulators use when they're testing a car's emissions. They put the car on rollers in a garage, and they stick instruments up the tailpipe, and they run a simulated driving cycle. It's supposed to simulate hills and city and highway and so on. But the cycle itself is predictable. It's public knowledge what that cycle is. And so what Volkswagen did is program the computer to recognize when that curve was when the car was being driven according to that cycle, and then to crank up the pollution controls so that the car would look clean. The car, if they had the pollution controls up all the time, the car couldn't take it. Some of the components would fail, but it could deliver clean tailpipe emissions some of the time. So, and it's worth noting that there was a serious debate among those present about whether this was really a good thing to do. There were people that were against it who felt bad about it, but at the end of this meeting, which lasted less than an hour, they decided to go ahead. And the last words of the senior person there as they left the room was, "Don't get caught." I think another thing that's worth noting about this this behavior was that, if you look at the banking scandals, people were motivated by money, by greed. They wanted to get bigger bonuses, stock options, whatever. That wasn't a factor here. The people who did this were really just trying to hang on to their jobs. None of them got promoted or any more money. It was just about keeping your job. And I think that says a lot about Volkswagen culture and the culture of fear that existed there. I think the other important thing is that it would have cost Volkswagen maybe a couple $100 more per car to make it clean. And also, as the years went on, there was many times when the changes in models, changes in the design of the cars, when they could have upgraded the emission system to make it compliant. But every time they came to one of these decision points when they could have made the cars clean, they didn't. Once they got started cheating, it was a habit that was hard to break. And this went on until early 2014, and I just want to back up a little here. The regulators never tested cars on the road. It was always in a garage, and that's what made it possible for Volkswagen to cheat. But in the mid-90s, there was a guy at the EPA who started working on portable emissions technology, something that you could put in the vehicle and drive and measure the emissions as they were underway. And I don't want to embarrass him, but he's in the room right now. That's Leo Breton. Raise your hand, Leo. Leo was the guy who started experimenting with this and developed and he owns some of the patents on the technology that makes it possible to measure emissions, makes it possible to measure emissions underway. And that was really very crucial in the whole chain of events that led to Volkswagen being exposed. So in many years later, 2013, there was a nonprofit group called the International Council on Clean Transportation. And they wanted to see what kind of technology the German car makers were using in the United States with their diesels. Because at the time there was a debate in Europe about making the standards stricter, and the car makers over in Europe were saying, no, we can't do it, it's impossible. And this nonprofit, the ICCT, said, well, wait a minute, they're doing it in the United States and they're saying they can't do it in Europe, what's going on? So they awarded a $70,000 grant to a group at West Virginia University, which has a center that's well known for its expertise in emissions testing. And they tested two Volkswagens, a Passat and a Jetta. They did it out on the West Coast. It was mostly just a bunch of graduate students, several of them from India. And they quickly noticed there was a big difference between what the emissions they produced when they were out on the highway and what they produced in the lab. The students had first tested the cars in the lab to sort of get a baseline, and then they took them out on the road with this portable technology which Leo had invented, by then had been commercialized, and saw that there was something wrong. And they didn't actually at that point know exactly what was wrong, just that something was fishy. And they published a study about that in early 2014. Nobody much noticed, but outside the industry, outside this very kind of subculture of people who follow emissions, but among those who noticed was the California Air Resources Board, which is the regulator that enforces the clean air laws in California. And they were concerned enough that they put together what they call a compliance project. They used their cloud as a regulator to assemble a small fleet of Volkswagens and then did intensive testing. And if Volkswagen had been smarter, they would have at that moment confessed and said, mea culpa, we did something bad, we're really sorry, we'll fix it. But that's not the way the people at Volkswagen ticked. And instead, they mounted a cover-up which wound up lasting a good year and a half. And they fed the regulators misleading information, false information. There was this dialogue between the California regulators and Volkswagen, long discussions about what was causing this problem. And Volkswagen kept telling them that it was some technical issue, they would get it under control. They did a recall to update the software. That didn't fix the problem. But it was all basically just a smokescreen delaying the day of reckoning. And finally, you have to give CARB some credit. They really kind of stuck with it, kept pushing, and eventually in September 2015, Volkswagen ran out of excuses. One of their engineers went up to one of the top people at CARB at a conference and said, it's a defeat device. In other words, that's what this type of software is called, as a defeat device, because it's designed to defeat the emissions. And the regulators were extremely angry, to put it mildly, because they felt they had been jerked around for a year and a half. And that made the whole thing much more expensive for Volkswagen because they had squandered any goodwill they might have had with the regulators. I think if they had fessed up right at the beginning, it might have cost them in the hundreds of millions or maybe a few billion at the most, and wound up costing them $22 billion in the United States so far. And there's still a lot of outstanding cases in Europe. So where do we stand now? There's been the settlements that I mentioned. 6 executives have been indicted One of them is in jail, a guy named Oliver Schmidt, who was one of the point people with the regulators. He made the mistake of visiting the United States for the Christmas holidays and was arrested at the airport. The other people that have been indicted are in Germany, which does not extradite its own citizens. And the investigations are continuing. I mean, one thing I'm often asked about is how high up did it go? I'm not sure we fully know the answer to that yet. But we do know, and I just wrote about this for the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, that back in 2007, there was an extensive discussion at the level just below management board with people exchanging emails and PowerPoint presentations where they went into some detail about how this illegal software would work. Now, Volkswagen says that knowledge never made it to the next level at the management board. We'll see what happens. But in any case, a year and a half later, it's still a big issue for Volkswagen. It would be easy to say that Volkswagen, that this is something exceptional to Volkswagen because it does have a unique history, but I think that actually it's something that could happen at any large corporation. I don't think it's at all unusual in the corporate world for managers to set very ambitious goals and to make it clear that the penalty for failure is to get fired. And I think a recent example is Wells Fargo, the California bank, which had a very similar type of thing, not involving consumer fraud. And I think that the lesson from a business point of view is that there's nothing inherently wrong with setting ambitious goals for people, but it has to be very clear what the boundaries are, how far you're supposed to go to meet these goals. At what point do you say, I can't do this ethically or legally, and we have to come up with a different plan? And that's what was missing at Volkswagen. The engineers who did this obviously felt this was expected of them by management, and also that they had no play. Those who had concerns, who worried about whether that was the right thing to do, they had no place to turn. They had nobody they could go to express their feelings without destroying their own careers. And I think the other thing is that it's crucial that if companies have values, and Volkswagen had a code of conduct, they had a compliance department, but what really matters is the signals that are coming down from the top. And if you have, your head of personnel is found to have been supplying prostitutes to labor leaders, and nobody really seems all that upset about it. A few people take the fall, and then business goes on as usual. I think that sends a much more powerful signal to the people at below management than any code of conduct or anything written on paper. Just looking to the future, I think Volkswagen will survive the scandal. It's a very powerful company. They have a lot of cash. I don't think there's any issue of them going bankrupt, but it has hurt their market share in Europe. Diesel, which is a big part of their business model, is dropping. The popularity of diesel in Europe is dropping very quickly. That's a problem, and for perhaps not surprising. And I think the biggest problem for Volkswagen is that this is really a moment of transition in the auto industry. Silicon Valley companies are getting interested in the auto industry. You have Tesla building electric cars. You have Google working on self-driving cars. Apple is said to be working on things, Uber. And these companies actually have a lot more money than the car makers because they're worth so much on the stock market. So the car makers have to be adjusting to this, and Volkswagen now has to do that with a lot less money than they would have had before. They would certainly rather be spending that $22 billion on research and development than on fines and legal settlements. And then I guess, I mentioned at the beginning it was a tragedy, and I think that's really true. It was in many ways, Volkswagen was an incredible success story when you look at how it rose from the ashes of World War II and became the biggest car company in the world. One of the ironies of the whole story was that a couple of months before the scandal broke, Volkswagen actually surpassed Toyota as the largest car company in the world. I think that surprises Americans because we think of Volkswagen as being a kind of a niche brand, but in the rest of the world it's huge. It's huge in China. It's the biggest car maker in Europe by far. And they became the biggest car maker, and then 2 months later this scandal hit. And I guess the biggest takeaway is just it shows how important it is for, purely from a profit point of view, never mind a moral point of view, for companies to have an ethical foundation. If you don't, I think Volkswagen shows that the people who ultimately pay the price are the employees, who in Volkswagen's case are overwhelmingly hardworking, honest people who may wind up suffering because Volkswagen made itself vulnerable to a handful of graduate students with a $70,000 grant. So I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you, everybody, for coming. If you have a question, please come to the microphone. Yes, sir.
I want to ask the question first so you can remember it. Then I want to say some things about Volkswagen. The question is, could they have modified these diesels? Because they certainly, even if it cost $5,000 a car, would have saved them an awful lot of money to $15 billion, because that isn't clear. My first Volkswagen was, I got out of the Army in 1961. I had 40 miles on it, and a kid being chased by the state police hit my rear tire at a light. I took it into the Volkswagen, or it was towed to the Volkswagen dealer, and the white-coated former Panzer mechanic in charge of the department said, "We will fix this car as good as new." I mean, it became a watchword among my friends about this. Actually, he couldn't, because he couldn't get a frame, and they had to give me a new Volkswagen. I then had a Super Beetle around 1971 and never had a Volkswagen again until the 72 model diesel, which was the best car I have ever owned. It was fast, efficient, and I never spent a cent on maintenance in 5 years. I followed the
maybe you could get to the question.
Yeah,
a little
the question
faster,
was the first
yeah.
one. The question was the first one. But I spent months dealing with them on getting the money for this car. I mean, months on the phone as they changed the rules.
You mean of the car you have now?
Yeah, and
right.
They would say, show up with this particular power of attorney, and I would show up with it, and they say, oh, you should have faxed it in. I'd say, doesn't say it on the form. Yeah, but you should have. Second time, oh, you didn't fax in your title. I said, well, this went on until I stumbled. My daughter's gardener is a lawyer who turned out to be a class action lawyer in a previous life.
Right.
And he knew the firm that was the lead firm. And then I got things passed through. But it took 6 months. I finally got paid last week.
Yeah.
When
Well,
this should have happened much
Maybe I
later.
should explain that what you're talking about is after Volkswagen got caught, there was then a class action suit which was settled, and Volkswagen owners had the option of either selling their cars back to Volkswagen or taking compensation and getting their cars fixed up to a certain level. But did you have a question, sir?
Well, the question was, why could they have upgraded these and then avoided this whole payback?
Yeah, they could have. It would have cost more. I mean, I've seen different estimates about how much more, but a couple of $100. I mean, I think when they first started out, they thought it was a stopgap. It was not something they were planning to do for almost a decade. I think they just wanted to get that first generation of cars into the U.S. market, and then they would improve the vehicles. But I think once they did it, it was easy, it was cheap, nobody seemed to notice, and it became a habit. I mean, they later did switch to a better technology. With without getting too much into details, it's something that uses a tank of this urea solution to neutralize the nitrogen oxides. That's a more effective technology. They switched to that starting, I think, around 2012, but they were worried that the U.S. buyers wouldn't want to keep refilling the tank, so they programmed it to sort of ration this fluid. And again, it was a legal car. That would have been a very good time to have upgraded the technology, and they would not have the problem that they do. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks very much. It was a great presentation, and I especially enjoyed the one of the ideas that you got to right at the end when you were talking about looking to the future. And you spoke in general about it's not just Volkswagen. You have some other examples of sort of poor corporate governance when you look at Wells Fargo and so forth. And so the question is, do you sense that because of those and other similar things that there's any sort of trend towards improving? Your suggestion for how to deal with this was that, well, yeah, management can be very ambitious, sort of implicitly set sort of a deal or arrangement on engineers, designers, workers, whatever, that they got to solve this problem or they have to reach these goals or whatever, or their jobs are in the balance, but to not go beyond certain ethical limits. So
Exactly, yeah.
how would that work? It seems to me if you tie your job to performance, keeping your job to performance rather than salary and compensation, that it's going to be extremely hard for an employee to make that ethical decision. So
No, I
one
agree,
way
yeah.
would be for a trend in governance in general to sort of get away from that thing. So I don't know if there's, what do you think, and do you see any signs of that kind of
Well,
trend in corporate
Yeah.
in corporate behavior?
I agree with you that if you tell people that if they don't meet their goals, they're going to get fired, then that's also inviting bad behavior, because people think short term, and maybe somewhere they're thinking, well, if I do this in 5 years, I'll go to jail. But what's really on their mind is, if I don't do this in 3 months, I won't be able to pay my mortgage. And so I think that you can't have these totally draconian penalties. I think it's probably better to have incentives. But I think the other key thing is that the top management has to clearly express what are the company values and what are the ethical standards, and then live it themselves. If people below management level perceive that management is not really taking it seriously, then it's all worthless. So I think that's really the crucial element.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
How are you? I very much enjoyed this because I was in Europe in October of 2017 when this broke out. My question, I understand that Volkswagen used slave labor during World War II from the Nazi-occupied countries. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, and I get into that in the book to some extent.
Okay.
Yeah. Mhm.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. No, what she's what she's referring to is that, like Volkswagen, like all pretty much all German companies during World War II, they used forced labor, slave labor, whatever you want to call it. But Volkswagen used even more than most companies, because when the war broke out, it was a pretty new factory. They didn't have a big workforce already. And Wolfsburg, if you've been there, it's really kind of out of the sticks in Germany. It's not near any urban area, so they didn't have this workforce that they could draw on. So when the war started, they had sometimes people were semi-voluntarily there, or people from occupied countries who were not voluntarily there, and also people from concentration camps, including Auschwitz. And they had SS guards and towers and barracks. In some ways, it was practically a concentration camp during the war. Yes, sir.
Well, this kind of rapacious management may have been unique to Volkswagen, and maybe not. But
I don't think it was. I mean, the consequences.
I don't
were
either.
not.
But so you shouldn't. I don't get that impression that it was. But anyway, the competitive forces, particularly in Europe, on diesels are very, very strong, and so you think that the competitive advantage that would have been granted to Volkswagen by this defeat device would have been noticed by its competitors, who, in order to survive, would have done it also. And now we're beginning to see hints of this in new lawsuits against Fiat and even GM and Mercedes.
Yeah.
and all of the German makers eventually. So when is Volume 2 going to come out, or did you see any hint of this? Did you see any hint of this in the research you were doing for this
Yeah,
book?
well, and I've written about that. I mean, one thing that that people have realized as a result of the whole Volkswagen scandal is that basically in Europe, everybody was cheating in one way or another. The thing is that in Europe, enforcement of the emissions rules was basically a farce. I mean, there was really no enforcement at all. There's no penalties if you get caught. The worst thing that happens is you have to do a recall. So it's almost like an invitation for people to do it, because the worst thing that happens is you have to install the technology you should have installed in the first place. And there's a growing realization of that. I think that the big difference with Volkswagen is they tried to bring that kind of attitude to the United States. But to get back to your question, yes, I think actually because of Volkswagen has 25% of market share in Europe. It's twice as big as the nearest competitor. So if Volkswagen is doing something, it's basically impossible for anybody else to compete unless they do it too. And the only difference was that the companies selling cars in Europe, there's so many loopholes in the European rules, they could basically cheat legally. And there's been a lot of testing showing that the discrepancy between highway emissions of diesels in Europe and the lab emissions is enormous. And people are realizing that, and that's one reason why diesel market share is going down. Leo?
Yeah, Jack, I'm just wondering, in your research, if you came across anyone from Volkswagen who knew that road testing had been done in the past and was possible, or was it that insular that nobody
They
knew
don't seem
about
to
it?
have taken it seriously, and that's one of the mysteries, because it's not like it was a secret in the industry, but one problem with Volkswagen is they had a headquarters mentality.
Yeah.
The people in Wolfsburg thought they knew everything. They didn't listen to people at ground level. They were famous for not listening to what their people in the United States were telling them about the U.S. market, and they just don't seem to have taken that threat seriously, which obviously was a huge mistake.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Leo.
It's a follow-up on that, your criticism of the European emission control regulators, which was pretty slam dunk, I guess. What's the political blowback going to be from that? I mean, there are green parties in most major European countries, and they're moderately successful. I assume that this is making their day for them.
Yeah, no, it's a big political blowback, and the environmental groups have been saying this for years, and nobody really listened to them. I mean, they've been saying for a long time, if you look at what the actual nitrogen oxide levels are in urban areas in Europe, they're way higher than they should be if car companies were actually adhering to the standards. So there's a big debate going on.
A little follow-up, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
I read that there was a move afoot to consider rejuggling the taxes on gasoline versus diesel, which are favorable toward diesel in Europe on purpose,
right?
As an sort of almost an anti-oil crisis measure from the 1970s. It's
right.
An ancient policy now.
Yeah.
Is that making any progress, or?
Well, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but yeah, just to give a little background to the rest of the audience, that in Europe, diesel fuel is basically subsidized because the tax is usually about 10 cents less than for gasoline, and so it's cheaper at the pump than gasoline, which is not the case in the United States. So the policymakers actively promoted diesel because the car makers had convinced them that it was cleaner than gasoline, and particularly that it was less of a threat to global warming and also fuel efficient. And that's true about diesel. You have to say that a diesel engine burns fuel more efficiently than a gasoline engine, so the carbon dioxide output is lower than, gallon for gallon lower than a gasoline engine. But they had neglected to look at the nitrogen oxide emissions. And yes, there's a huge debate about that, and I think things will change. Thank you.
In your reporting, did you run across anything about a successful class action for fraud in New York State for the VW rabbits for excessive oil consumption?
No, I've heard, I've gotten some emails about that, but I'm not aware of that. I mean, I've really just focused on the emissions issue.
Yeah, this was 1980s.
Oh, okay.
A long time ago.
Yeah, no, that's not something I looked into, to be honest.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So in the discussions that have just taken place, the European regulating agencies have come up for criticism. And my question is whether the U.S. Agencies that were in charge of writing and enforcing the regulation should also be criticized, in the sense that if they write a regulation, they should know the technology levels that are realistic and what has to be done to comply with it. And it's almost like Volkswagen came up with something that sounded too good to be true, so it probably was. And yet for years they weren't found, and they weren't found with their own initiatives. It's other people who did work. If it's primarily EPA, have they come under criticism? Have they done any soul searching and admitted that the process has to be better in the future between technologies and enforcement?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good point, that these cars were on the road for almost a decade without anybody noticing. I think part of the reason was that diesel had such a small market share in the United States. I think Volkswagen at the most sold maybe 80, 100,000 a year. So it wasn't really big on anybody's radar screen. But I think the other factor, and this is something I've talked to Leo a lot about, is that the regulators were very attached to their labs, their testing facilities, which they've invested a lot of money in, and they were very reluctant to do road testing. And to be honest, I think they still are. I don't perceive any wholesale change in their thinking. They're certainly more aware of ways that companies might cheat. My impression is that they still think that they can they can use their labs to find that out, that they don't need to get into road testing, which engineers don't like, because there's so many variables you can't control. If everything's in a lab, you can control the temperature, and every car does exactly the same cycle. That appeals a lot to some engineers and scientists, and I think there's still a reluctance to give that up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm a journalist. I'm a Brazilian journalist based here in DC. So I used to cover the Petrobras case, and the corruption there was big. Also leads to one impeachment and maybe to a second one. We really don't know. I wonder if you can compare both cases, Volkswagen case and also the Petrobras case, because in Petrobras case, it was like tens of people were involved, maybe more than 100 people. And also many construction companies were involved. One of them just signed a plea bargain with 77 executives over there. So how many people were involved in this Volkswagen scandal? And also I would like to know if politicians were also involved.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's no exact number. I mean, my personal view from just the reporting I've done is it had to be in the hundreds, because this is something that went into numerous Volkswagen models, and each car had to be configured separately. So it's hard to imagine how that could have been done. Volkswagen always tried to maintain it was a small group of rogue engineers, but that just didn't make sense. You need a lot of people to do this, and there certainly was a lot of discussion about it inside the company. Petrobras, it's hard for me to compare because I don't know so much about that case. But certainly it is amazing that so many people can be sort of swept up into a conspiracy like this, and then for top management to say they never heard anything about it. But that's what they say.
If I may follow up.
Sure.
Was there any consequence in terms of any political consequence in Germany?
Right, I didn't answer the second part of your question. This is something that people have suggested. I don't think it's proven that the politicians were aware that Volkswagen was cheating. Certainly, the government is very protective of the car industry, and they had a history of blocking regulatory changes that were bad for the German car makers. And there's in fact hearings in the German parliament that are looking exactly at that question. But as far as I know, no one's proven that anyone in government knew about this. Thank you.
What is the role of Audi in all of this?
Well, Audi, which is a division of Volkswagen, and they use a lot of the same components, motors and so on. Audi, the software that they use that could recognize the test cycle, that was actually invented at Audi. They had Audi, the first diesel Audis, when you first started them up and they were cold, they made a lot of noise. So they came up with a function in the computer that if the car was not being tested, they would adjust the fuel injection, some of the other parameters so that it was quieter when it started up, because they didn't want that to be something that turned off buyers. And if the car detected that it was being tested, then it would be noisy because, you know, they wanted to pass the test. And then what happened at Volkswagen was when they were dealing with their emissions problem, someone realized that Audi, that the software was already in the computer, and they adapted it for Volkswagen's purposes. So Audi played a role, and Audi, in fact, separately paid a big settlement in the United States. I forget the exact figure, but it was somewhere under $2 billion. And and 3-liter Audi motors had this illegal software, as did some Porsche SUVs, the Cayenne models. So Audi played a role, although Audi doesn't seem to be suffering as much, its reputation doesn't seem to be suffering as much. People associate this with Volkswagen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just several days ago, I happened to see a snippet in the newspaper. Chrysler Fiat has been questioned about a similar situation.
Right.
Do you have any comment on that?
Sure. The Department of Justice just was it even this week or last week, has sued Fiat Chrysler, saying that there was also illegal software, or that Fiat Chrysler was cheating on emissions rules in diesel pickup trucks and SUVs, about 100,000 vehicles in the United States. We don't really know how that's going to turn out or what it was about. It doesn't appear that there was a study that done by some academic researchers who actually identified the software inside the Fiat Chryslers, but it was less sophisticated than what Volkswagen had. It was, according to the study, just a timer that ran the emissions controls for about 25 minutes after the car was started, and then cranked them, then lowered them. And it happens that the official test lasts 22 minutes. So that meant that they could be pretty sure that no tester would notice. Fiat Chrysler is disputing that this was a defeat device, but they've just been sued by the DOJ, and that's and Daimler is also being investigated. So it seems like something that is going to affect other car makers, although I don't think anyone did it on the same scale in the United States as Volkswagen, or with the same sophistication. Yes?
Sorry, but I didn't catch whether you'd drawn conclusions, generalizations in the book on this one incident. It's obviously happens quite a bit, like with Petrobras and others, or whether just in the process of writing the book you were thinking about how that might occur so broadly across companies and within the context of maybe the societal norms, or like whether these things should be, rather than on a company basis, it should be on a societal basis almost. But I'd be really kind of interested in what you thought about how these occur and why they occur and what kind of incentives and things like that make them happen, and or what it is in people and that kind of thing. I just expect you did cover that a little bit. Just was trying to get you to expound a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I mean the book's mostly about Volkswagen. I do at some point there's a chapter where I go into that in a little more detail. I mean, I didn't do a systematic study of other companies and how this type of thing arises, but it's not that hard to come up with other examples. Enron, Wells Fargo, the banking crisis, Deutsche Bank. It's they all sort of follow that same pattern of a corporate atmosphere where there's rule breaking is tolerated, and there's very ambitious goals. Yes.
Hi. You mentioned that the exact stressors involved in the testing cycle and their order were a matter of public knowledge,
Yes.
matter of public knowledge, which strikes me as a little bizarre, that companies would know exactly what they're up against as regards testing. Do you think consumers would benefit by these tests being made more secret, or else more random, or both?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that the law says that cars are supposed to be clean basically under any circumstances, and if there's any exceptions, any circumstances where the car needs to protect the engine or whatever, needs to sort of temporarily turn down the controls, that's supposed to be something they discuss with the EPA.
And as a follow-up, do you think it's realistic that might occur at any point soon? And if they were made completely secret, might that open up other avenues of corruption?
I think, well, yeah, that might be a problem. I mean, this is not something I've really thought about that much, to be honest, but I think that it's fine to have this sort of publicly known cycle, but you should also do things to check whether the car is just tuned for the cycle or whether it can, be clean under more or less normal circumstances.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry for double dipping.
That's okay.
There's a very common question here when an
Yeah.
author gives a compelling story like you did. Are you in talks to make a movie or a documentary?
Yes, well, there's 2 documentaries in the works, which they've interviewed me. I'm not involved in the production. One for Netflix and one being done by the same guy named Dale Bell, who who made the original Woodstock documentary. And then there's also the Leonardo DiCaprio's production company has bought the movie rights to the book, Appian Way, and they're working with Paramount. And from what I can perceive, from my point of view as an author, they're serious about making a movie, and it's going forward. So yes, yes, please.
Can you talk about some of the challenges of writing the book while there is an ongoing investigation? For instance, did you uncover information that the Justice Department is now curious to know more about? Can you talk a little bit about your sources? What were the challenge of trying to write a book in the middle of an ongoing investigation?
Yeah, that was a challenge. I mean, the way we did it was, John Gillespie and Norton approached me, and it was a couple of weeks after the story broke, and he said he wanted a manuscript in a year, which is pretty tight to write a book, and especially when you're working full time. And the New York Times is actually more than full time. So, but the way I did it is I just started chronologically with the company history, writing one chapter after another on weekends, and giving them to John as I finished them. And to be honest, I was very nervous whether within a year I would know enough to be able to write a story that kind of had a logical ending. But as it turned out, that was possible. The hardest thing about the reporting, of course, was getting people with inside knowledge to talk to me. And I was successful in getting a number of people who had, very close knowledge of what was going on to speak to me on a confidential basis. And the way I did it was pretty simple, actually. I was able to figure out some of the names from academic papers or patents, who had worked on the emissions at Volkswagen, and then I just wrote them letters. And I wrote a lot of letters, sometimes multiple letters to the same people, and most people didn't respond, but enough did that I was able to get, I think, a pretty good picture of what was going on inside Volkswagen. And then when a year was up, it happened that Volkswagen had settled in the U.S., so that was kind of gave the book a conclusion, although there's continued to be developments, and I've continued to write about it for the New York Times. And there's an epilogue in the book, and although I turned the manuscript in November last year, we were adding to the epilogue recent developments until I think March, before the book finally had to go to press, and then I couldn't add any more. And I'm hoping for future editions or paperback edition or whatever, that I can continue to sort of enhance, because I'm always learning new things. I'm hoping to keep making it better. Yes?
I would like to know whether they were non-German car manufacturers that tried to introduce their diesel version into the United States. I do remember that Peugeot had a turbo diesel in the 80s, and I wonder whether there were other non-German manufacturers.
I don't think there was. There were probably some others. Yeah, you mentioned Peugeot, but I don't think anybody really got traction.
May I mention that I badgered my Volvo dealer because I'd driven Volvo diesels in Europe, and I saw there were all these diesels running around, clean diesels, soi-disant. And so I asked him, why can't you have a diesel here? Why can't I drive a diesel, get 50 miles to the gallon, right? He said, we've tried, but we get rejected.
Yeah,
And
I
that
think
was
there probably
Volvo.
had been attempts, but I think when Volkswagen, in 2008, when Volkswagen first started the clean diesel advertising blitz, there was something like 16,000 diesel passenger cars in the United States, a very small number. So no one had ever been successful at it, and Volkswagen really pushed. And I didn't mention that, but that was another of the big mistakes they made, was they did this clean diesel advertising campaign that was quite extensive. They had Super Bowl ads, very clever advertising, and they were pretty successful in getting people who were environmentally conscious to buy the cars, and that's one reason why it wound up being so expensive, because it was not only the illegal software, but this huge consumer fraud. And I get emails still all the time from people who said, you know, I was looking at a Prius and they convinced me this was as clean as a Prius and I liked the way it drove. And those people are, you know, very upset, as you can imagine. So I think that's seems to be all the questions. So thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it, and I'm very happy to sign books.